The air in Santa Fe in the autumn of 1869 tasted of dust, dry sagebrush, and the distant, heavy scent of impending change. The sun beat down with a relentless final heat on the adobe walls of the Salazar Ranch, baking the earth into a brittle, unforgiving shell. Annie Salazar, at 17, moved through the house like a phantom, her skirts kicking up fine, pale dust from the wooden floors. The silence, normally a comfort, had become a crushing weight since the announcement. Her father, a man whose stern features were perpetually chiseled by sun and worry, had sealed her fate with a single, unyielding decree. "You will marry Silas Thorne," he'd announced at the dinner table, his voice flat as the mesa horizon. "His ranch borders ours. The union will secure our land, our future." Silas Thorne. A name that conjured the image of a man 20 years her senior, a cowboy, in the rugged, unforgiving sense, a man with calloused hands, a cold stare, and a reputation for treating his horses better than his workers. He was not a good man, everyone knew it, but his land was prime, and in this isolated territory, land was everything. Annie's mother, Elena, a woman whose spirit had been slowly eroded by the hard life and her husband's dominance, had merely looked down at her plate of dried beans, her hands trembling. "It is for the best, Annie," she'd whispered later, the words devoid of conviction. A woman must secure her position. The following morning, Annie found herself staring at the small, crudely bound family Bible. The passage she fixated on was not one of comfort, but of obedience and sacrifice, words that felt like a mockery of her own burgeoning desire for freedom. She walked out into the yard, the sun already high and brutal. The ranch was an isolated world, miles from the bustle of the Santa Fe Plaza, surrounded by the harsh, beautiful landscape of New Mexico territory. The only noise was the clanging of the water pump and the dull, rhythmic hammering from the barn, where her younger brother, Tomas, was mending a fence. Annie's confidante, Maria, the older, quieter woman who helped her mother with the house and cooking, found her by the pump. Maria was a Pueblo woman whose presence had always been a quiet, grounding force in Annie's turbulent life. "You look like the storm clouds over the Sangre de Cristos, mija," Maria said, her voice low, a soft counterpoint to the dry wind. Annie didn't turn around. "I am to be sold, Maria, not married, sold to a man who smells of whiskey and cold iron." Maria sighed, her gaze sweeping over the arid land. "Your father believes he is doing what he must to survive this land. It is the custom, hard though it may be." "Custom," Annie spat, turning to face her, her eyes blazing with a cold fire that belied her youthful features. "Custom that makes me a chattel, a bargaining chip, I will not do it." "Be careful of your words, Annie. Walls have ears out here, and the desert listens." But Annie was not listening. Her mind was a whirlwind of desperate possibilities, each one more fraught than the last. She had a keen, almost obsessive interest in medicinal herbs, a knowledge she had gleaned from Maria, who used local flora for minor ailments. She knew what healed, and by extension, she knew what harmed. That afternoon, while crushing dried oregano for the evening stew, Annie's gaze drifted to a small sealed jar high on a shelf in the corner of the pantry. A jar Maria kept clearly labeled with a stern warning. It contained the powdered root of a certain desert plant, a beautiful, innocent-looking thing that grew in the shade of the cottonwoods. Maria had often warned her of its danger. "A pinch of this, mija, and a man simply sleeps and never wakes. But it leaves no trace, no sign of violence. Only peace. Keep away." The jar seemed to glow in the dusty light filtering through the small window. It was the antithesis of the violence Annie felt in her heart. It offered a silent, clean solution to a brutal problem. It promised to erase the immediate, terrifying future awaiting her. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic, trapped bird. She could run, but where? The wilderness would swallow a girl alone. She could appeal to her father, but he was stone. Her mother offered no strength. There was only this, a clean break. a sudden quiet sleep for those who sought to force her into a life she could not endure. She spent the evening watching them. Her father, strong and oblivious, carving a piece of dried beef. Her mother, silent and defeated, knitting by the hearth. Tomas, her only brother, a sweet-natured boy but already being molded into a mirror of his father's hard authority. He was not marrying her off, but he would inherit the land, the power, and the right to make the next cruel choice. They were a single, suffocating unit. Lying in the dark, the sounds of the ranch settling down, the creaking of the old wooden frames, the distant howl of a coyote, were no longer comforting. They were the sounds of her prison. The thought of Silas Thorne's heavy, unfamiliar hand on her, his demanding presence in her life, was the final, sharp turn of the screw. The following day, under the guise of preparing a special blend of seasoning for their dried meat supplies, Annie carefully, methodically, and with a terrible, chilling resolve, reached for the jar. The fine, pale powder felt like flour between her fingers, innocent and ordinary. She did not mix it into the main family stew that night, not yet. She needed time and she needed an alibi, but she knew the decision was made. The weight of the adobe walls and the endless dust of Santa Fe had pushed her to the edge, and the sight of the powder offered a silent, terrible kind of salvation. She slipped the jar into a small, hidden pouch in her skirt, the cold glass pressing against her skin, a constant, chilling reminder of the path she was choosing. The path of utter, irreversible isolation. If you are enjoying this intense journey into realistic psychological terror and suspense, please take a moment to hit that subscribe button. Your support keeps these long-form, deeply layered horror stories coming to the channel. Annie spent the next 2 days in a state of chilling precision. The small glass jar of powdered root, hidden beneath the floorboards of her closet, was the silent center of her universe. Her movements became mechanical, her expression carefully neutral. She was playing the role of the dutiful daughter, a sudden, unnerving calm settling over her in stark contrast to the internal storm. The weather mirrored her tension. A strange, suffocating heat clung to the valley, the sky a pale, hazy blue. The wind, when it came, was hot and dry, rattling the glass in the few windows and carrying the scent of distant wildfires. A common, yet always unsettling element of the New Mexico territory. Her target was clear, the immediate family unit that held her captive. Her father, Elias Salazar, the patriarch and architect of her forced marriage, her mother, Elena, the compliant enabler, and her brother Tomas, whose casual assumption of authority grated on her soul. Her greatest asset was Maria, not for collaboration, but for her trusted presence. Maria was the one who made the atoll every morning, a thick, nourishing cornmeal drink, often spiced with cinnamon, served hot before the grueling workday began. Maria, busy with the cows and chickens, often delegated the final preparation and serving to Annie. This was the gap in the system, the crucial opportunity. Annie approached Maria in the pantry, the air thick with the smell of dried chilies and herbs. "Maria," she said, keeping her voice low and even. "Father asked me to prepare a special batch of dried meat for his long trip next week to the rail station. He wants it heavily seasoned to keep the insects away, and he asked for some of that strong cayenne pepper, the very hot stuff, the one that makes your hands burn." Maria, kneading dough for tortillas, nodded distractedly. "Ah, the red powder, mija. It is in the far corner. Be careful. It will ruin the taste if you use too much, but it certainly keeps the pests away." Annie retrieved the cayenne, a coarse, dark red powder, and brought it to the table, along with a small, identical-looking tin she had prepared. Inside the tin, she had mixed a tiny amount of the root powder with an equal amount of the hot cayenne. The powders were similar in texture, and the intense heat of the pepper would serve two purposes. It would disguise the slightly earthy, bitter taste of the root, and it would explain any physical discomfort. The following morning, the sun rising over the Sangre de Cristo Mountains painted the adobe ranch a soft, dusty rose. The family gathered for atole. Elias was already stern, discussing the need to ride out to check the north fence line. "Annie," Elias commanded, not looking up from his bowl. "The atole is weak this morning, and your seasoning on the beans yesterday was bland." Annie swallowed, her mouth dry. "Forgive me, Papa. I've been feeling poorly. I made a new seasoning blend, a mix of new cayenne. I prepared a small amount for the dried meat, but I put just a touch in the atole this morning, to wake us up." She served the bowls. Her father took a large, loud sip. He coughed, his face instantly flushing. "Good heavens, girl, that's fire!" he barked, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand. "It is the new cayenne, father. Very strong. I apologize." Her mother and Thomas took smaller sips, their eyes watering instantly. Elena coughed delicately. "It is potent, Annie." Thomas merely grunted, pushing his bowl away. "Too hot. I'll just take water." Elias, despite the heat, forced himself to finish the bowl. He was a man who never backed down from perceived weakness, even a cup of overly spiced drink. He stood up, towering over the table. "I'm riding out. The heat will be fierce. Elena, you see to the stores. Annie, fetch water for the horses." The first dose had been administered to Elias, small, masked by the cayenne, but present. A test. Annie spent the morning in the stables, the smell of hay and leather a brief, sharp distraction. Her heart remained a frozen knot. She watched her father ride away, a silhouette against the blinding sun. Later that afternoon, Elias returned early. The heat had intensified. He stumbled into the house, clutching his head, his face a sickly grey beneath the tan. "The sun," he muttered, collapsing onto the nearest bench. "The sun is beating down on my skull like a hammer. I've never felt this weak." Eleanor rushed to him, concerned. "Perhaps you should rest, Elias. The journey can wait." "Rest? And let the coyotes take our land?" He scoffed, but his usual booming authority was muffled, weakened. "Annie, fetch me a strong cup of your mother's mint tea, and no of your infernal cayenne." Annie went to the kitchen. Her hands did not shake. This time there was no disguising spice, no strong flavor to mask the bitter taste. She added a slightly larger amount of the powder to the tea, hoping the mint and sugar would suffice. This was not a test. This was the next step. When she presented the tea, Elias drank it quickly, the cool liquid a relief against the internal heat. He lay down on the cot by the fire, breathing heavily. Thomas walked in, looking concerned. "Father, your saddle wasn't tied correctly. I fixed it." Elias did not respond. His eyes were closed, his breathing becoming shallow. Elena looked at Annie, her face etched with a sudden raw fear. "He is too pale, Annie. He is ill." Perhaps the water was bad, or the sunstroke was worse than he said. Annie stood by the doorway, her shadow long and distorted in the late afternoon sun. She looked at her father, who had once been a pillar of unyielding strength, now reduced to a pale, struggling form. A chilling, perverse sense of calm washed over her. It wasn't triumph. It was the terrifying, cold finality of her choice. "He will sleep," Annie murmured, her voice unnaturally steady. "He only needs to sleep." But a prickle of genuine unease struck her as Maria entered the room, her gaze sharp and questioning. Maria did not look at Elias. She looked only at Annie. The connection between them, the shared knowledge of herbs, now felt like a terrifying, dangerous bond. Maria's face was unreadable, a mask of the old desert wisdom, but her eyes held a spark of suspicion that made Annie's blood run cold. The silence in the Salazar ranch the following morning was not the ordinary quiet of the isolated desert. It was the slow, creeping silence of a presence withdrawn. Elias Salazar did not wake up. Elena Salazar was in hysterics. her grief a chaotic, loud thing that jarred against the stone-cold certainty in Annie's heart. She paced the small living area, wringing her hands, her voice pitched high with a mixture of sorrow and confusion. It was the sunstroke. It had to be the sunstroke. Elena wailed, looking frantically between Annie and Thomas. He never rests, never drinks enough water. God forgive him. Thomas, however, was quiet, his grief manifesting as a tight, suspicious confusion. At 15, he was a boy on the cusp of manhood, eager to assume his father's authority. And he was already observing the world with a critical, inherited Salazar gaze. He looked at his father, pale and still on the cot, then at the half-finished mint tea mug on the small table. He looked ill, yes, but not this, Thomas said, his voice husky with unshed tears. He walked to the window, staring out at the harsh, indifferent landscape. We should send for the local priest in Santa Fe and the doctor, though the doctor will take a day to ride out. No, Annie interjected, her voice sharp, too quick. She forced a calming breath. No, the doctor will only tell us what we already know, the heat. We are too far, the dust. It will be days. He is already gone. We must prepare him. She walked to her mother, pulling her into a stiff embrace. Mother, we must be strong. We must honor him now. Maria can help us prepare the body. Maria was already there, hovering near the doorway, her gaze fixed on the body. She had examined Elias quickly, silently, pressing her cool fingers to his pulse points and eyelids. Her expression, however, had shifted from mere suspicion to a deep, terrible comprehension. Later, while preparing the customary shroud, Maria spoke to Annie in a low, even tone, the language of the Pueblo people, a language the others did not fully understand. "Tu sabes," Maria said, her hands busy folding the linen. "You know." Annie did not flinch. She met Maria's eyes, her own a hard, unwavering blue. "Yo no sé nada. El sol era cruel." I know nothing. The sun was cruel. Maria paused, her fingers resting on the linen. "The herb that brings sleep. It leaves no marks of violence, it is true. But the breathing is shallow, the skin cool, not hot like the sunstroke. It is a peaceful death, Annie. Too peaceful." Annie leaned closer, her breath smelling of mint and fear. "He was going to sell me to a brute, Maria. He was going to put a noose around my life and pull. Now I am free. And you will say nothing. Because if you say anything, Tomas will become the master. And he will demand you stay here, under his rule, forever. You want freedom too, don't you? Silence is your freedom." The conversation, held in hushed tones over the silent body of the patriarch, was a chilling, desperate negotiation. Maria, who had suffered her own quiet subjugation on the fringes of the Salazar ranch for decades, wavered. She looked at the raw grief of Elena, the confused anger of Thomas, and the cold, terrible resolve of Annie. The burden of proof, of accusation, was too heavy, too dangerous in this isolated land. "We must send a rider to Silas Thorne," Elena suddenly cried, remembering her responsibilities even in her anguish. "The land agreement, the marriage, Elias would want it secured." "No," Thomas declared, stepping forward, his chest puffed out with a new, shaky authority. "I am the man of the house now. I will ride out to Silas. I will tell him the marriage is postponed indefinitely. We will wait until father is buried. He has no claim on the land, or on Annie, until the papers are signed." Annie watched Thomas, her little brother suddenly acting the man. His first act of assumed authority was to protect her, but only by asserting his new patriarchal right to control her. He was still Elias's shadow. The threat was not gone. It had only changed hands. That evening, the family gathered for a somber meal of dried mutton and tortillas. Annie prepared a fresh batch of atole for the morning, setting the mixture aside. She knew her mother and Thomas would be too grief-stricken, too busy with arrangements to manage the cooking. "Thomas," Annie said, touching his shoulder, "you must eat. You have a long, hard ride tomorrow to Silas's place." Thomas nodded, his face pale. He was already carrying the weight of the ranch, the burial, and the inevitable confrontation with Silas Thorne, a powerful man who would not take the news of the broken engagement lightly. Annie looked at her mother, who was sipping a small amount of warm milk, her eyes red and puffy. The mother who had silently sacrificed her daughter to the security of the land. They are all part of the same threat, Annie thought, a terrible final coldness settling in her soul. The new authority is just the old one in a younger body. The structure must be dissolved entirely. As she moved about the kitchen later, tidying up the dishes, she knew what she had to do. The remaining powder, now a terrifying symbol of her liberation, would have to be used. Not just on Thomas, the new master, but on her mother, the woman who had taught her the meaning of silent servitude. The poison had been a key to her prison. Now it was the only way to ensure the door remained permanently unlocked. The cold, dry wind of the New Mexico plains seemed to whisper a terrifying truth. In this unforgiving land, the only way to be completely free was to be completely alone. The funeral for Elias Salazar was a somber, small affair. The local circuit preacher rode out from Santa Fe, his words swallowed by the vast, dry landscape. The few neighboring ranchers who attended kept their distance, whispering about the suddenness of the death and the strange, bloodless pallor of Elias's face. The day after the burial, the second phase of Annie's terrible plan unfolded. Thomas, exhausted from the emotional strain and the labor of the burial, awoke with the sun, ready to ride to the Thorne Ranch. He came into the kitchen, his young face etched with determination. "I need a strong breakfast, Annie," he announced, trying to sound like his father. "Silas Thorne will not be gentle. I need my strength to face him." Annie was already stirring the new batch of atole. This time, she was generous with the powder, knowing she could not risk a partial result. She also poured 2 other bowls, one for her mother, Elena, who was still too distraught to cook for herself, and one for herself, a simple bowl of milk and water to maintain her facade. She was careful to use the atole Elias had rejected days earlier, a batch Maria had prepared and then set aside. This was a detail of crucial importance, establishing a timeline that pointed away from her. "I've used the atole Maria made the day before Father was taken ill," Annie explained, handing him the bowl. "It is thick and warm. You'll need it." Thomas drank greedily, the rich cornmeal and spice a welcome warmth in his empty stomach. Elena, fragile and tearful, managed to sip half of hers before setting the bowl down. "I have no appetite," she confessed, her gaze distant. Annie ate her own simple bowl, watching them. The waiting was the worst part, a psychological torment far worse than the act of administration. Within the hour, the symptoms began. Thomas, already saddled and ready to ride, complained of a sudden crippling weariness. "My legs are lead, Annie. I must have strained myself digging Father's grave." He sat down heavily on a stool, rubbing his temples. "I need a moment. The sun is too bright." Elena, resting in her room, was more withdrawn. When Annie checked on her, her mother was pale and clammy, drifting in and out of consciousness. "I feel as if I'm sinking, Annie. Everything is too heavy." Annie knew the herb worked by slowing the heart and dulling the senses, leading to a profound, peaceful sleep. She knew the time was short. She walked into the stable, watching as Thomas slumped forward, collapsing quietly into a pile of hay, the saddle still in his hand. He looked like a tired child, the authority melted away from his young face, leaving only innocence. Annie felt a brief, terrifying pang of regret, quickly suppressed. He would have become a man like Father. He would have bound me again. She returned to her mother's room. Elena was barely conscious, her breath shallow. Annie sat beside her, taking her cold hand. "Mama," Annie whispered, her voice rough with a complex, perverse mixture of genuine grief and relief. "I am sorry, but I cannot marry Silas Thorne. I cannot be you." Her mother's eyes fluttered, searching for Annie's face. "The ranch, Annie, the Salazar name." Elena trailed off, the words dissolving into a weak sigh. Annie held her hand until the breathing stopped. A quiet, imperceptible cessation of life. This death was different from her father's. It was the death of a shared history, of a flawed, beloved connection. The emotional weight was staggering. Now, she was alone. Completely, terrifyingly alone. The immediate crisis was the appearance of the second and third bodies. Annie knew the local doctor, Dr. Ramirez, who was half a day's ride away in the small settlement of Galisteo, would notice the chilling similarity between the deaths. The simultaneous passing of the remaining family members, just days after the father, would inevitably raise deep, dark suspicions. Annie had to control the narrative. She rushed out to the barn, her movements frantic yet precise. She had to ensure that the time of death pointed to the source, Maria's old atole, and a natural, unfortunate cause. She found Maria near the chicken coop, her face still etched with the memory of the previous conversation. Maria looked at Annie, the truth already written in her sharp, knowing eyes. "They are gone, aren't they?" Maria stated, her voice flat, devoid of emotion. "The boy and the woman, gone to follow the patriarch." Annie collapsed against the wooden railing, the hot midday sun beating down on her head. "It was the only way, Maria. They would have chained me. They would have sold me." "Freedom purchased with blood is a short-lived thing," Maria murmured, her gaze distant, looking out at the mountains. "The desert gives you only what you earn. And this is a debt you will pay." "You must help me," Annie pleaded, scrambling to her feet. "You must say that the atole was old, that you had set it aside days ago, that the cornmeal was bad, that the stomach sickness took them both. Quickly." Maria walked closer, her eyes locked on Annie's. "Why should I lie for you? You have become the monster your father was, Annie, only cleaner and quieter." "Because of Silas Thorne," Annie whispered, playing her last card, hitting the nerve she knew was raw. "He is coming here, soon. He will not only take the land, but he will take me, whether I am a bride or an orphan. If the family is gone, the land is mine. He will arrive to find me alone. If you do not help me, Maria, he will stay. And he will rule both of us." Maria's expression hardened. She looked out at the isolated road, the knowledge of Silas's brutal character, a physical weight in the air. Survival in this territory was the highest law. She finally nodded, a tiny, reluctant movement of her chin. "I will tell the story of the bad cornmeal, but I am not your servant, Annie. I am your witness, and I will leave this ranch before the sun sets." The alliance was forged, not on trust, but on mutual fear and a shared enemy. Annie was free, but the ranch, once her prison, now felt like a terrifying, echoing mausoleum, with Maria's dark promise of departure leaving her completely exposed to the danger that was already riding toward her. The afternoon was a blur of grim, desperate activity. Maria, true to her word, helped Annie with the necessary practical preparations. They laid Eleanor and Thomas side by side on the same cot where Elias had passed, covering them in the cleanest white linen they possessed. I will say that the spoiled atole caused a sickness, a fever and terrible weakness that claimed them quickly, Maria stated, her eyes avoiding Annie's. "It is a lie, but a believable one. Sickness spreads fast on the frontier." Annie's focus was entirely on establishing her own innocence and credibility. She deliberately showed visible distress, not the raw, wrenching grief of a daughter who had lost her mother and brother, but the stunned, terrified confusion of a young woman suddenly alone. "I must ride out to Galisteo for the priest and the doctor," Annie announced, her voice trembling. "I can't face this alone." Maria nodded, already packing a small, worn leather bag. "It is the right thing to do. Go now. I will stay here until the sun is low to watch the house, then I will leave before the riders return. I want no part of what follows." Annie knew Maria was severing the last fragile thread of her connection to the Salazar ranch. In a way, Maria was taking the moral high ground, leaving Annie to face the fallout of her monstrous choice. As Annie saddled the fastest horse, the sun began its slow, majestic descent, painting the western sky in hues of violent orange and dark purple, the blood of Christ Mountains living up to their name. She was just about to mount when a dust cloud appeared on the horizon. Not the small single cloud of a lone rider, but a larger plume, suggesting a party. "Trouble," Maria muttered, stepping out of the house, her hand instinctively resting on the small, worn knife she kept tucked into her skirt. The riders approached quickly, the thunder of hooves breaking the oppressive silence. It was not the doctor or the priest. It was Silas Thorne and two of his hired hands. Silas, a man in his late 30s with a heavy beard, piercing blue eyes, and a confident, swaggering air, pulled his horse to a halt, the animal snorting loudly. He dismounted, his boots hitting the hard-packed earth with an authoritative thump. "Where is Elias, girl?" Silas's voice was rough, accusatory. "He missed our arranged meeting 2 days ago. I was promised a discussion about the merger." Annie stood frozen, the sudden, terrible reality of his imposing presence a physical shock. He was larger, rougher, and more dominant than her memory had allowed. Maria stepped forward, her posture rigid, a protective wall between Silas and Annie. "Elias Salazar is dead, Mr. Thorne. God took him suddenly 2 days ago. A heat stroke." Silas froze, his eyes narrowing. He looked at Maria, then at Annie, then back to the ranch house. His suspicion was immediate and palpable. "Dead?" he repeated, his voice dropping to a dangerous growl. 2 days ago, and no word was sent? No rider? He walked closer, his scrutiny intense. A man as strong as Elias Salazar doesn't just fall over from a hot day, woman. He was old and stubborn, Annie managed, her voice finding a fragile strength. He refused to rest. And now my mother and my brother are gone too, Mr. Thorne. It was the sickness. The cornmeal was bad. They took ill this morning. A terrible fever. The lie tumbled out, fast and desperate, a mixture of truth and fabrication. Silas's eyes, however, did not reflect sorrow. They reflected cold, calculating realization. "Mother and brother too?" he asked, a chilling smile slowly spreading across his face. He looked at his two hired hands, a gesture that signaled control. A remarkably convenient wave of tragedy, wouldn't you say, boys? He turned back to Annie, his expression now one of absolute dominance. "So the Salazar land, the ranch, the horses, the stock, they all now belong to the only living heir. You." Annie swallowed, trying to project the image of a vulnerable, terrified orphan, not the cold-blooded executor of her family's demise. "I need to leave now, Mr. Thorne. I am going to Galisteo for the priest. My family needs a proper burial." "You are going nowhere," Silas stated, his hand shooting out to grasp her wrist. His grip was heavy, crushing. "I am not leaving this ranch until I have seen the bodies, secured my claim, and secured my future. You are under my protection now, Miss Salazar. And since the father who was supposed to protect you from me is gone, I will do the protecting." He pulled her close, his breath smelling of stale tobacco and sweat. "You will show me the bodies, and then we will discuss the matter of the land and the matter of you, in that order." Maria, seeing the raw, terrifying violence in his grip, stepped back, her face a mask of regret. She knew her fragile promise of silence was now a prison for Annie. Silas, dragging Annie behind him, marched toward the house. "You will ride out later, Maria," he commanded. "Go to the kitchen, prepare a meal. I am starving, and I will be staying here until the legal matters are settled." As Silas forced Annie through the doorway, her gaze briefly met Maria's. In that moment, Annie understood the terrible irony. She had poisoned her family to escape Silas, only to find herself trapped by him in a far more isolated, terrifying reality. A house of the dead, with a predator as her sole menacing guard. The debt Maria spoke of was already due. Silas Thorne released Annie's wrist the moment they stepped into the main room of the Salazar ranch. His grip had been a silent, brutal declaration of ownership, and his presence now filled the house, pushing out the last vestiges of comfort and safety. He walked straight to the cot, Annie following him, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. Silas stood over the two shrouded forms of Elena and Thomas, his expression unreadable. He did not touch them, but his scrutiny was intense, professional, and terrifyingly cold. "Uncover them, girl," he commanded, his voice low. Annie hesitated, her mind racing. The quiet pallor, the lack of struggle, these were the hallmarks of the poison. Could he, a cowboy and rancher, recognize the lack of a natural death? "They look peaceful, Mr. Thorne. It was a fever, a sickness," Annie whispered, her body trembling with a mixture of fear and adrenaline. Silas ignored her, reaching out and pulling the linen sheet from their faces. Elena's face was serene, almost beautiful in death. Thomas, too, looked like he was merely sleeping. Silas knelt, his large, rough hand pressing briefly against Thomas's neck. He looked at the boy, then at the woman. He didn't speak for a long moment. No signs of violence. He finally conceded, standing up. No bloat, no feverish flush, and no smell of sickness. Just quiet. He walked over to the kitchen area, his gaze sweeping over the hearth and the pantry. He found the small amount of leftover, slightly spoiled cornmeal that Maria had intentionally left out. He sniffed it, a look of distaste crossing his face. "Bad atole, you said," he mused, turning to Annie. "A sickness that takes 3 people, one after the other, with no struggle, no vomiting, no signs of discomfort, just a quick sleep?" He shook his head slowly. "I've seen men die, Miss Salazar, from heat, from bullets, from cholera. This is not cholera. This is too clean." Annie stood her ground, forcing herself to meet his gaze. "You accuse me, Mr. Thorne? I am a young woman, alone and heartbroken, and you accuse me of killing my own family?" She let a single, well-placed tear roll down her cheek. "If you believe a crime has occurred, you must ride to Santa Fe and bring the marshal." This was the card she had to play, the threat of external authority. In the New Mexico territory of 1869, the marshal was a distant, slow-moving force, and Silas Thorne, a man who preferred to operate outside the law, knew the risks of inviting official scrutiny to the land he coveted. Silas hesitated, his eyes flashing with calculation. If he rode to Santa Fe, he risked losing control of the ranch to the bureaucracy of the territory. If he stayed, he could control the story and the orphaned heiress. He made his choice. He took a heavy breath, composing himself. "I accuse no one," he said, the lie smooth and cold. "I merely observe that the Salazar ranch is now yours, and since I was promised the land through marriage, and you are now an unmarried, vulnerable woman, I am simply ensuring the terms of the original agreement are met. You need a guardian. You need a protector. You need me. I am not marrying you," Annie stated, her voice stronger than she intended. Silas walked toward her, his proximity filling her with dread. "You have no choice. The entire territory knows of the arrangement. We will bury your family, and then we will ride to the nearest justice of the peace. The land and the woman will be secured." "The land is mine," Annie insisted, "and I have not agreed to be secured." Silas chuckled, a dry, unpleasant sound. "You are 17, Annie, an orphan. Do you think the territorial law will grant control of this prime ranch to a child alone?" No. A court-appointed guardian will be found, a lawyer, a man of influence. And I am right here. The arrangement is simple. Marry me, or watch a stranger take your land and tell you what to do for the next 4 years. He left the room, his 2 hired hands, Jed and Curtis, taking up positions outside the door, silent, menacing guards. Annie was not only trapped, she was under direct, hostile surveillance. She ran to the kitchen where Maria was quietly packing the last of her belongings, her face turned away. "He suspects Maria," Annie hissed, clutching the older woman's arm. "He knows it wasn't a fever. He's holding me prisoner. He will force me to marry him." Maria pulled her arm away gently. "I told you, Annie. Freedom purchased with blood. Your debt is paid, not to them, but to the land. You have cleared the path for the real predator. You promised to leave. If you stay, he will suspect your silence is purchased. He will question you." Maria looked at the floor, then up at Annie. "He commanded me to cook. I will cook, and then I will go. I will give you what help I can, but you must be smart, Mija. He is watching everything." Annie suddenly remembered the small jar of powder still hidden beneath the floorboards of her closet. She had cleared her family, but the real threat was not a family bound by love and custom, but a stranger bound by greed and force. The poison had been her key to freedom. Now it was her only remaining weapon. But she had to get to it, and she had to use it without leaving the slightest trace of suspicion. With Jed and Curtis stationed outside, and Silas monitoring the ranch, the danger was now external, immediate, and utterly relentless. The suspense had tightened its grip, replacing internal dread with a paralyzing external fear. The ranch fell into a grim, tense routine dictated by Silas Thorne. He treated the house as his own, sitting at Elias Salazar's desk, reviewing old ledger books, his 2 hired hands, Jed and Curtis, maintaining a silent watch over the property. Annie, now the terrified orphan, played her role flawlessly. She was withdrawn, moving quietly about the house, her only companion the heavy shadow of Silas's presence. She was focused on 2 things, the impending marriage and the hidden jar. Silas had announced that they would ride to the Justice of the Peace in Galisteo in 2 days, following a hasty private burial. The timeline was closing rapidly. Her immediate problem was the constant surveillance. Jed and Curtis were always within earshot, and Silas, even when engrossed in the ranch accounts, seemed to be listening to every creak of the floorboards. Annie realized she needed a diversion, something that would draw Silas's attention and create a small, crucial window of opportunity. That evening, as the dry, cold air descended upon the mesa, Annie deliberately let out one of the family's prize quarter horses, a nervous, high-strung gelding named Diablo. She did it quietly, opening the gate just enough for the animal to bolt out into the darkness. Within minutes, the frantic whinnying of the other horses alerted the men. Silas burst out of the house, cursing loudly. "Diablo is loose! Jed, Curtis, mount up and find that horse. He's worth more than the 3 of us combined." The 2 hands scrambled to their mounts, the sudden chaos a welcome rush of noise and movement. Silas stood by the porch, yelling instructions, momentarily distracted by the loss of valuable property. Annie used the moment. She slipped into her room, pulled up the loose floorboard in her closet, and retrieved the small, cold glass jar. She then went to the kitchen, her heart hammering. Maria was there, quietly chopping onions for the dinner stew, her face impassive. She looked at the jar in Annie's hand and then at the open door, where Silas was still shouting orders into the darkness. "You have chosen your path," Maria said, her voice barely a whisper, "but you must not use it here. If he dies like the others, no one will believe the cornmeal story now. He already suspects." Annie realized the terrifying truth of Maria's warning. The clean, quiet death that had freed her from her family would be the exact evidence that convicted her now. "I need to leave a sign," Annie murmured, her eyes wild, her mind scrambling for a new strategy. I need a reason for him to be gone, or to look like he did it himself. She looked around the dusty, rough-hewn kitchen, her gaze falling on a half-empty bottle of cheap, potent whiskey that Silas had brought with him. He had been drinking it steadily since he arrived, his consumption accelerating as he dealt with the confusion of the deaths and the sudden complex inheritance. Annie had an idea. It was risky, brutal, and utterly final. She mixed the remaining powder into the whiskey bottle, stirring it carefully with a small twig until it was completely dissolved. The bitterness of the powder would be entirely masked by the harsh, burning liquor. "He will drink this when he comes back," Annie whispered to Maria. "He will drink until he is unconscious. He will look like a common drunkard who passed out in the heat. It will be a natural mistake." Maria looked at the tainted bottle, then back at Annie, her eyes full of pity and fear. "You have become a serpent, Annie, silent and deadly. But serpents leave a trail. The trail will lead to the whiskey," Annie declared, placing the bottle back on the counter next to a newly opened account book. The men returned an hour later, exhausted and empty-handed. Diablo was gone. Silas was furious, his face dark with rage. "That beast of a horse! I'll have his hide when I catch him." Silas roared, stomping back into the house. He spotted the whiskey and immediately reached for the bottle, unscrewing the cap with an angry, practiced motion. He lifted the bottle to his lips, but paused, looking at Annie. "Go to your room, girl," he commanded, taking a long, deep swig. "And think about the name you'll take after the wedding. Thorne. It has a good ring to it." Annie obeyed instantly, walking quickly down the hall. She heard the sound of the gulping, then a heavy sigh from Silas. She knew the dose was massive, meant to fell a powerful man instantly. She didn't sleep. She sat in the darkness, listening. The sounds were few: the distant wind, the nervous shifting of the remaining horses, and finally a heavy, dull thud from the main room. Silence. A profound, absolute silence. She crept out of her room. Maria stood in the hallway, a small, dark bundle in her hands, her packed belongings. They peered into the main room. Silas was sprawled across his father's desk, the whiskey bottle on the floor, its contents seeping into the wooden planks. He was still, inert. "He is gone," Maria whispered, her hand moving to the doorknob. "I am leaving now, Annie. I cannot stay here any longer. I will tell the people of Galisteo that you are alone, that the fever took your family, and that Silas Thorne rode out and never returned. I will say I fear for your safety." "Thank you, Maria," Annie whispered, her voice cracking. "Go." Maria slipped out into the cold, silent darkness. Annie was completely alone. She stood over Silas. She had to make his death look like an accident, a tragic end to a drunken rancher searching for a runaway horse. She looked at his heavy, inert body, the perfect picture of an accidental death. A massive dose of poison masked by a massive dose of cheap, burning liquor. She had secured her freedom, but the cost was 3 lives, an isolated ranch, and a predator who had died from a drink meant to save her. Before we continue to the final chapters of this terrifying story, if you are on the edge of your seat and want more deeply realistic suspense and psychological horror like this, please subscribe to the channel. Your subscription fuels the mystery and ensures we keep bringing you the most intense, long-form narratives. The following morning, the silence was shattered by the sound of approaching hoofbeats. It was not Dr. Ramirez or the local priest. It was the territorial marshal of Santa Fe, a tall, weary man named Garrett, accompanied by a stern-faced deputy. Maria, true to her word, had raised the alarm, not about the poison, but about the ranch's sudden, total isolation and the ominous presence of Silas Thorne. Annie was ready. She had spent the early morning meticulously staging the scene. She had carried the heavy body of Silas Thorne out to the dusty porch, draping him over a chair, the empty whiskey bottle carelessly placed beside him. She had smeared a bit of dirt on her own face, roughened her hands, and assumed the mantle of the terrified, orphaned victim. Marshal Garrett dismounted, his boots crunching on the gravel. He took one look at the house, the small, fresh mounds of earth marking the family graves, and the huge, still figure of Silas Thorne slumped on the porch. "Miss Salazar?" the marshal asked, his eyes sharp and assessing. Annie ran to him, tears finally coming naturally, tears of sheer terror and exhaustion. "Marshal, oh, thank God, it was Silas Thorne. He forced his way in. He wouldn't let me leave." She pointed to the cot inside. "My mother, my brother, they died of a terrible fever days ago, a bad sickness from the cornmeal, and then Silas Thorne came. He said the land was his. He drank all night, Marshal, that awful, terrible whiskey. He was ranting about the land and my marriage." She gestured to the bottle. "He was wild. He tried to force me. I ran and hid in the barn. This morning he was like this. I was too terrified to touch him." Marshal Garrett, a veteran of countless frontier tragedies, was instantly suspicious. The sight of a wealthy, powerful man like Silas Thorne, a man known for his robust health and ruthless business acumen, dead from an apparent overdose in the early hours of the morning, was certainly unusual. The quick succession of deaths in the Salazar family, followed by Silas's sudden demise, screamed of foul play. "Where is your help, Miss Salazar? The woman Maria?" "She left last night, Marshal," Annie explained, keeping her voice high and breathless. "She was too scared of Mr. Thorne. She said she was riding to Galisteo to bring word of my trouble." The marshal walked over to Silas, examining the body. He sniffed the whiskey bottle, the overpowering smell of cheap alcohol hitting him. He noted the lack of any struggle, any defensive wounds on Annie. "3 deaths in 4 days, Miss Salazar," the marshal stated, his gaze boring into her. "First a heat stroke, then a fever, and now a drunken fall. It stretches the bounds of coincidence, wouldn't you say?" "I am alone, Marshal," Annie said, collapsing onto a chair and covering her face with her hands. "I am just a girl. I only wanted to bury my family in peace. Do you think I killed all of them? I couldn't even lift Mr. Thorne's body. I am heartbroken and I am afraid." The deputy, a younger man named Caleb, knelt by Silas's head. "Marshal, look here. He's very pale and his breathing is shallow. It doesn't look like a typical drunken stupor. It's too quiet." Annie's heart stuttered. The deputy was right. She had used the last of the poison, and it was a lethal dose, but the poison was subtle, and the whiskey was overwhelming. "The son has been brutal, deputy," the marshal countered, rubbing his chin. "And that whiskey is rot gut. He probably had a massive seizure from the liquor and heat combined. Dr. Ramirez will be the judge of that." Marshal Garrett made his decision. He couldn't arrest the sole heir of a large ranch without hard evidence, especially a young woman who presented as a terrified victim. He needed the doctor's word. "Deputy, ride to Galisteo. Bring Dr. Ramirez back immediately. Miss Salazar, you will stay here. You are not to leave the property. I will stay here and secure the ranch. I need to review your father's ledgers." Annie felt a cold thrill of success. The immediate threat of Silas was gone, and the marshal was playing into her hands. He was looking for a logical, frontier-based explanation. But now, she had a new, more dangerous hurdle: the doctor's professional examination. She had to get to Dr. Ramirez before the marshal did. She had to ensure the narrative of the fever and the drunken stupor held fast. But the marshal was now her guard, and she was trapped on her own land. She had secured her freedom only to be placed under a new, official, and inescapable surveillance. The silence of the ranch was now the heavy, watchful silence of the law. The tension in the Salazar ranch was unbearable, a silent, psychological standoff between Annie and Marshal Garrett. Annie, the frail orphan, and Garrett, the wary lawman, were locked in a dangerous dance of suspicion and performance. Marshal Garrett spent the afternoon poring over Elias Salazar's account books, his presence a heavy, critical weight. Annie busied herself in the kitchen, making the Marshall coffee and a simple meal of tortillas and beans. She was the perfect, subservient host, a victim trying to survive. Her mind, however, was focused on the approaching arrival of Dr. Ramirez. The doctor, a knowledgeable man, would be the only person who could identify the symptoms of the rare desert poison. Annie knew her narrative, the bad atole and the drunken stupor, was too clean, too perfect. She needed a confession, but not from herself. She needed to implicate the one person whose story would be immediately believed. Maria. Marshall, Annie said softly, bringing him a cup of coffee. I need to speak with you. I cannot hold it in any longer. Garrett looked up, setting down the heavy ledger. What is it, Miss Salazar? Annie sat across from him, her face a picture of shattered innocence. It wasn't the cornmeal, Marshall, not entirely. It was Maria. She poisoned them. Garrett's eyes narrowed. Maria, the woman who worked here. Yes, Annie whispered, tears welling up genuinely this time, fueled by her own self-loathing and fear. She was angry. She had been with my family for years, treated more like property than a worker. She learned about all the herbs, both for healing and for harm. Annie explained the setup she had discussed with Maria, twisting the story into a narrative of Maria's revenge. She wanted to be free, Marshall. My father was a stern man. She knew if she poisoned the family, the land would be mine, and I would have no choice but to sell it. She wanted the sale to go through so she could take a portion of the money and leave the territory forever. She administered the poison. Garrett pressed, his voice sharp. Yes. In the atole, Annie confirmed, the words tasting like ash in her mouth. The first dose was too weak for my father, but it weakened him. Then she gave the real dose in the tea, and then the atole to my mother and brother. I saw her with the powder, Marshall. She threatened me. She said if I told, she would use the powder on me, too. The confession was a masterpiece of misdirection. It explained the poison, Maria's quick departure, and the perfect, non-violent nature of the deaths. It turned the blame onto an isolated, defenseless woman of the pueblo, a perfect scapegoat for a frontier crime. Garrett was silent for a long time. The confession had a disturbing ring of truth. In a land where class and race lines were brutally drawn, the revenge of an oppressed servant was a plausible if tragic story. And Silas Thorne? Garrett asked, his gaze fixed on her. Silas Thorne, Annie said, letting out a small, terrified laugh. He was the last chance for Maria to secure her freedom. She must have thought if she kept me here and Silas forced the marriage, he would stop me from selling the ranch. She came back last night, Marshall. She must have seen the commotion with the horse, found the whiskey, and slipped the last of the poison into his bottle to stop him from taking control. It was a plausible narrative of a frantic, desperate woman trying to secure her revenge and her future. The Marshal nodded slowly, the weight of the frontier logic settling the case for him. She should not have been treated like property, he said, the statement a final judgment. She will pay for her actions. Just then, a commotion outside signaled the arrival of the deputy and Dr. Ramirez. Dr. Ramirez, a small, gray-haired man with kind, weary eyes, walked into the house, his gaze instantly fixing on the three bodies. He moved with the quiet professionalism of a man used to the brutality of the frontier. The marshal intercepted him. Doctor, we have 3 deaths here. Heat stroke, then a fever, and now Mr. Thorne. Drunkenness. But Miss Salazar has confessed a darker truth. A woman named Maria, a servant, poisoned them all, fueled by revenge. The poison was a rare desert herb, a sedative that induces a clean, quiet sleep. The doctor knelt by the cot, examining the bodies of Elena and Thomas. He looked at their placid faces, then at the details of their hands and skin. He then went out to Silas. He returned, his face grave. He looked at Annie, then at the marshal. Marshal, Dr. Ramirez said, his voice low and firm. The girl's story is entirely plausible. This kind of sudden, profound sedation. It is the work of a highly concentrated dosage of datura root, or something similar, a poison known only to the native tribes. It leaves no trace of a fever or a struggle. It is a terrible, quiet way to die. Annie felt a rush of cold relief. The confession had worked. The narrative was set. But Marshall, the doctor continued, his gaze returning to Annie. The datura root, it is extremely bitter. You would need a vast amount of strong spices or a very sweet drink to mask the taste. I have seen children spit out a mere mouthful of it. To administer it to 3 people, one after the other, and have it pass as a bad meal or cheap whiskey. That would take an immense, focused resolve. He looked directly at Annie, his eyes filled with professional, terrifying doubt. It is plausible a vengeful servant could do this, but it is only plausible. I would only believe it if the administrator was a person of iron will and terrifying composure. The kind of composure that a victim would not possess. The doctor's words hung in the air, a final, chilling twist of doubt. He had confirmed the poison, but his description of the killer was a chilling mirror image of Annie, the surviving victim. The final day of the investigation began with a new, terrifying tension. Dr. Ramirez's veiled skepticism had planted a seed of doubt that even Marshall Garrett's frontier logic couldn't entirely dismiss. "The doctor confirms the poison, Miss Salazar," the marshal said, his voice heavy with renewed suspicion. "The datura root. If your story about Maria is true, we must find her immediately. Deputy Caleb has ridden out to track her." Annie maintained her composure, her eyes red, her posture frail. "I only want my family buried, Marshal. Then I want to sell this terrible place and leave the territory forever." The marshal watched her. He had seen grief, fear, and malice in his years on the frontier. Annie's performance was too polished, too consistent. The idea of a 17-year-old girl murdering her entire family and a powerful rancher was monstrous. Yet the facts aligned more closely with her own calculated, cold demeanor than the desperate revenge of the missing Maria. The marshal decided to search the house one last time with the doctor present. He was looking for any detail that defied the Maria narrative. He searched the pantry, the barn, and the bedrooms. Nothing. Everything was in order, the house showing only the signs of a quick, sad exodus. Dr. Ramirez, examining Annie's small bedroom, paused by the closet. He wasn't looking for a weapon. He was looking for a person. He noticed a faint, almost invisible scratch on the floorboards. Near the back wall, a mark covered by the shadow of the door. He knelt, his eyes trained. He reached down and lifted the small, loose floorboard. Beneath it, the marshal gasped. There was no hidden gold, no stack of letters. There was only a single dark stain on the earth beneath the floor. "What is this?" Garrett demanded, pulling out his knife and scraping a small amount of the damp earth into his hand. The doctor bent closer, his eyes sharp. "That, Marshal, is not just dirt. It is a residue, likely a bitter powder. Something that was kept hidden and that has been partially absorbed into the wood." He looked up at Annie, who stood by the doorway, her composure finally beginning to fracture, her carefully constructed mask slipping. "The poison, Marshal," Dr. Ramirez stated, his voice quiet but absolute. "The source was not in the atole or the whiskey. The source was here, hidden, and only the person who hid it would know where to look." Annie knew the end had come. Maria had inadvertently left the only piece of evidence that pointed directly to the true perpetrator. The marshal turned slowly, his eyes dark with a cold, terrible disappointment. "You lied, Miss Salazar. You didn't see Maria with the powder. You were the one who had it. You had the opportunity, the reason, and the means." He walked toward her, his hand resting on the holster of his revolver. "You poisoned your father because he was selling you. You poisoned your mother and brother because they were the next in line to control you. And you poisoned Silas Thorne because he was the new, inescapable threat. Your freedom came at the cost of every life around you. Annie could no longer speak. She looked at the doctor, who nodded with a mixture of pity and confirmation. He had done his duty. "I will not be sold," Annie whispered, her voice raw, not with fear, but with a terrible, unyielding defiance. "I will not be a piece of property in this desolate land. You are under arrest for the murder of Elias Salazar, Elena Salazar, Tomas Salazar, and Silas Thorne," Marshal Garrett announced, his voice regaining its firm, official tone. The deputy, Caleb, rode back into the yard, his face grim. "Marshal, I tracked Maria. She went north, but her horse threw a shoe near the river. She is gone, Marshal. She is free." Annie looked at the marshal, a flicker of something like triumph in her eyes. Maria was free. The innocent scapegoat had escaped the system. And now, she, the actual killer, the young woman who had waged a chillingly realistic war against patriarchy and subjugation, would face the only justice this isolated territory had. The sun beat down on the adobe ranch, the same pitiless sun that had witnessed the birth and death of so many dreams in the New Mexico territory. Annie, the orphan who had chosen murder over marriage, was escorted out of the house. As she rode away with the marshal, a final chilling realization settled over her. She was now entirely alone, facing an absolute, inescapable isolation. She had achieved her freedom, but only by trading the silent prison of her family for the cold, unforgiving justice of the frontier. The silent, peaceful sleep of the poison was her family's fate. The long, terrifying journey to Santa Fe was hers.